August 1943. Sicily was still on fire. The island baked under a white, merciless sun. Dust clung to everything: uniforms, trucks, bandages. Shells thumped in the distance, like a giant knocking on the door of the sky. In a field hospital, under sagging camouflage netting, a young American soldier sat on a canvas cot, shaking. He was 21. 2 weeks earlier, he'd still looked like it. Now his hands wouldn't stop trembling. His helmet lay on the floor by his boots. His eyes weren't really looking at the tent. They were fixed somewhere else, back on a ridge where the air smelled like cordite and burnt flesh, where his friend Eddie had been laughing 1 second and a red hole the size of a fist had opened in the middle of his chest the next. The doctors had scrubbed the blood off his skin. They couldn't scrub it out of his head. He heard the sounds again. The scream that cut off in the middle. The whistling shells. The sudden silence when a man simply wasn't there anymore. He heard someone shouting orders and somebody else sobbing behind a rock. Now he heard a nurse asking his name. He couldn't answer. "What's wrong with him?" another voice whispered. "Battle fatigue," the doctor said, low, but not low enough. "He's cracked." The word knifed through the boy. Cracked. As if he were cheap glass. He wasn't bleeding. He had all his limbs. He didn't have a purple heart. He had something the men around him did not respect and did not understand. He was terrified. He had tried, in the early morning, to walk back toward the front line. His legs had locked halfway there. His heart had pounded so hard he thought it would explode. Every sound made him flinch. He'd turned around and walked, then stumbled, then almost ran back to the hospital tents. Now he sat and shook and hated himself. The tent flap snapped open. General George S. Patton walked in like a punch. Even in a hospital full of broken men, he looked like something out of a recruiting poster and a fever dream at the same time. Polished helmet, riding breeches, pistols with ivory grips at his hips. His boots looked like they'd been shined in hell. Everyone reacted. Nurses straightened their backs. Doctors stiffened. Orderlies stood up without being told. Patton radiated a simple message in every step. "I am the standard. You will measure yourself against me and come up short." His eyes swept the rows of cots. He saw bandaged heads, missing arms, legs in slings. Real wounds in his mind. Visible proof of courage. His face, for a moment, softened. He believed that being torn apart for your country was the most honorable thing a man could do. Then he saw the boy. No bandages, no cast, no missing limb, just shaking hands and empty eyes. Patton stopped. "What's this man's trouble?" he barked, loud enough for everyone to hear. The doctor tried the safe word. "Battle fatigue, sir. He's—" Patton cut him off, with a look sharp enough to stop a truck. "I'll ask him," he said. He stepped up to the cot. The boy could smell leather and tobacco and some kind of sharp soap. He felt that gaze land on him like weight. "What's wrong with you, soldier?" Patton demanded. "Why are you here?" The boy's throat constricted. He tried to swallow. Nothing moved. "Speak up," Patton snapped. I can't take it anymore, sir," the boy stammered. His voice sounded small even to himself. "It's my nerves. I'm afraid to go back, sir." The tent seemed to shrink. You could feel the temperature drop 5 degrees. "Nerves," Patton repeated softly, as if tasting something rotten. "You're afraid." The boy's eyes fell. He couldn't look at him. "Yes, sir," he whispered. Something broke in Patton's face. He had been born into a family that collected wars, like other families collected silver. He had spent his childhood reading about Alexander and Julius Caesar, about Stonewall Jackson and armored knights charging into spears. In every story he loved, fear was something men crushed with willpower and prayer and rage. He had never forgiven himself for the one time in his own life when he had felt terror freeze him in place. He had buried that memory so deep he couldn't admit it even to himself. Now, here it was, sitting on a cot, saying the words out loud. "I'm afraid." "You're nothing but a goddamn coward," Patton hissed. His voice was so quiet at first that everyone in the tent heard it. The nurse beside the cot froze. The doctor's jaw clenched. The men in the other cots stared, some with pity, some with a look that said, "Please don't notice how much of me is like him." Patton's voice rose. "Coward, you hear me?" he shouted. "These men?" He swept his arm around the tent, taking in bandaged stumps, bloody gauze, pale faces. "These men have real wounds. They've been hit. And you sit here sniveling about your nerves?" The boy flinched, as if the words themselves were blows. "Please, sir," he whispered. I just can't." The slap landed faster than the boy could see it coming. A sharp cracking sound. Flesh on flesh. The entire tent heard it. His helmet crashed off the side of the cot and hit the floor with a hollow metal clatter. His dog tag snapped against his chest. One of the nurses gasped out loud. Tears jumped to his eyes. He hadn't even cried when Eddie died. Now, humiliated, with every eye on him, the tears came by themselves. Patton's hand came up again. Second slap. Harder. "You're going back to the front," Patton snarled into his face, so close the boy could taste the smoke on his breath. "You'll fight, or I'll have you shot. I won't have yellow sons of bitches in my army." The boy sobbed. There was nowhere to go. His legs wouldn't move. His soul wanted to crawl under the cot and disappear. The nurse stepped forward, instinct stronger than fear. "General, sir," she began, voice shaking. "He—" Patton swung his glare onto her. She stopped. He turned to the rest of the tent. "All of you," he shouted, "look at this. This is what happens when men think they can hide in hospitals from their duty. There is no room in this army for cowards. You hear me?" He didn't wait for an answer. He spun on his heel and strode out, the tent flap whipping behind him. Inside, everything was very still. The nurse slowly bent down and picked up the boy's helmet. Her hands trembled as much as his. The doctor stared at the entrance as if something sacred had been violated, as if someone had walked into a church and kicked over the altar. One of the other wounded men turned his face to the wall. The boy on the cot cried like a child, shoulders shaking, the red print of Patton's hand blooming on his cheek. Nearby, a captain took out a small notebook and quietly began to write down exactly what he had seen. It didn't happen once. A few days later, in another tent, with another shaking soldier, Patton did it again. Same stare, same words, same slap. Two broken minds, two sets of witnesses, one general who believed that fear was treason and humiliation was medicine. He walked away from both scenes, convinced he had done the hard thing that lesser men did not have the stomach for. He had no idea that those few seconds in a hot, stinking tent would follow him further than any medal on his chest. Because in a modern army, the most dangerous thing isn't what you shout. It's what someone writes down. News in the field doesn't move by official channels first. It moves by whisper. Did you hear? Patton slapped a guy. At the hospital. Called him a coward. Threatened to shoot him. The story reached mess tents and motor pools, aid stations and artillery batteries. It bounced from Sicily to North Africa, from medics to chaplains to officers who had already learned to fear Patton's temper and admire his results at the same time. Some said it with disgust. Some said it with a shrug. Some said it with a tight, nervous grin. The grin of men who weren't sure if they were hearing a crime or exactly the kind of savage hardness that wins wars. It reached one man by paper. General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat in his headquarters in North Africa, surrounded by maps. Arrows marked advances and retreats. Pins showed divisions. Phone lines connected him to London, Washington, Cairo. He was the supreme commander of Allied forces in the Mediterranean, a job that sounded glorious on paper and felt, most days, like being crushed between egos and expectations. A clerk brought him a report. He set down his pencil, finished the sentence he was writing, and only then looked at the page. It was a letter from a medical officer in Sicily. The language was careful, almost painfully respectful. It described George S. Patton walking into a field hospital, calling a traumatized soldier a coward, and striking him across the face. It described a second, similar incident with a different soldier. Eisenhower read it once. His mouth went dry. He read it again, slower. He could picture Patton as clearly as if the man were standing in front of him right now. The strut, the helmet, the pistols, the booming voice. He could hear him ranting about courage and cowardice and the need to toughen these kids up before the Germans chew them to pieces. He could also picture something else. A hospital tent. A young man shaking on a cot. A hand rising and falling. Eisenhower had known Patton for years. Before the war, they'd ridden together, argued about tactics, cursed bureaucracy. Patton had pushed him, fought for him, championed him when other officers wrote him off as a pleasant staff colonel. Eisenhower owed part of his career to Patton's stubborn belief in him. And now, that same man had done something Eisenhower could not defend. He turned his chair slightly and looked up at the map of Sicily pinned to the wall. Patton's 7th Army was ticking upward across the island. Towns taken, casualties inflicted, Germans retreating. Every red line on that map was proof of what Patton's ferocity could do. Eisenhower felt the pull of that. Patton terrified men into fighting harder. Sometimes that was exactly what the Allies needed. But if he ignored this, if he treated 2 slaps as nothing, as a boys will be boys moment in a dirty war, what was he saying to every private in the American Army? He looked back at the report. The doctor had been careful with his words. Eisenhower heard the fury under the calm. This isn't discipline. This is abuse. This is a general hitting a defenseless soldier in the only place that is supposed to be safe. Eisenhower picked up his pen. He wrote to Patton. The words were spare, but they cut. He told him that his actions were unjustified and unworthy of an officer and a gentleman. He ordered him to apologize to the men he had struck, not in private, in front of witnesses, in front of the very soldiers whose eyes had watched the slapland. When Patton read that letter, something in him nodded. Apologize. To a man who had cried in front of his comrades. To a man who had admitted fear. To a man Patton had already labeled a coward. It felt like Eisenhower was asking him to kneel before everything he hated. But orders were orders. So he walked back into the same tent. The boy on the cot heard the murmur outside first. That heavy, unmistakable cadence of boots that made everyone straighten without thinking. The flap opened. There he was again. Patton's presence hit the room like heat. Men struggled to sit up. Nurses froze halfway through bandage changes. The doctor's jaw worked, as if he were chewing words he knew better than to spit out. Patton walked to the cot he remembered very well. The boy's cheek still burned in his memory. The shock in those eyes. The way the whole tent had sucked in a breath together. Now, those same eyes stared up at him, wide and wary. Patton swallowed something that tasted like iron. "Soldier," he said, voice stiff. "I have come to apologize for my outburst. I was wrong to strike you." The word wrong came out like a bullet he hadn't meant to fire. The boy blinked. For a second, he thought he'd misheard. Generals didn't apologize to nobodies. They didn't come back into tents unless they were checking on their favorite wounded officers. "Yes, sir," he managed. The nurse stared, stunned. The doctor felt a small, hot rush of satisfaction. The universe, for one tiny fragile moment, seemed to tilt slightly toward justice. Patton turned to the rest of the tent. "Any man who is sent here," he forced out, "is here under orders. You are not cowards for being wounded or sick. You are doing your duty." He didn't say, "And so am I." He didn't have to. The way his jaw clenched said it. He walked out again, the apology hanging in the air like smoke. Inside, the silence was different this time. The boy looked at the nurse. She gave him the faintest smile. One of the other wounded men exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Outside, in the Sicilian sun, Patton's face twisted. He had said the words Eisenhower demanded. He had obeyed. But in his gut, he felt humiliated, not by the apology itself, but by what it meant. That someone else thought they had the right to judge how he forged men into warriors. That someone else thought they understood war better than he did. He climbed into his staff car, slammed the door, and spat his anger at the only audience available. His driver, his aides, the hot air. "This army is getting soft," he growled. "You can't win wars with men who hide behind their nerves. They want me to coddle crybabies. To hell with that." Those words, too, traveled. The apology went one way, through official channels. The rant went another, through human mouths. Between them, George S. Patton had given his enemies and his friends all the ammunition they needed to see him exactly as they wanted to see him. To some, he was the only man honest enough to say what everyone secretly thought, that fear was shameful. To others, he was something far more dangerous, a bully with stars on his shoulders. In Washington, a man who wore no uniform picked up the scent. Drew Pearson was a radio commentator with a habit of making powerful people uncomfortable. He didn't command battalions. He commanded microphones. He had sources in the War Department, in the Medical Corps, in the whispers of officers who had seen too much to keep quiet. A stack of letters and reports grew on his desk, all circling the same story. General George S. Patton had hit hospitalized soldiers in Sicily. Pearson read the details. He saw the words coward, slapped, field hospital. He imagined the scene, the cot, the trembling hands, the general's ringed fingers swinging. He could have made a phone call, let the army handle it behind closed doors, spared a famous general a public scandal in the middle of a global war. He didn't. On his radio program, in a deliberately calm voice, he told America what its hero had done. He didn't need adjectives. The facts were enough. People listening in their kitchens and living rooms heard the story of a man they had been told was one of their greatest warriors walking into a hospital, the one place mothers told themselves their sons would be safe if they were hurt, and slapping their boy across the face. They imagined their own kid on that cot, Some listeners exploded in rage at Pearson, not Patton. War is hell, they wrote. Men who crack endanger everyone. Patton is the only one with the guts to keep them in line. You are stabbing our army in the back. Others felt something colder. This wasn't a training camp. This wasn't a drill field. This was a hospital. A general hitting a sick soldier there felt like a line crossing from hard into cruel. Telegrams poured in. They didn't go to Patton. They went to the Pentagon, to Congress, and to Eisenhower. In his headquarters, Eisenhower read them. He read the ones calling Pearson a traitor and praising Patton as a necessary tyrant. He read the ones from mothers demanding to know why a man who hit their sons was still in command. He felt the vice close. He had tried to keep this inside the family. He had forced the apology. He had hoped the story would die in a file drawer somewhere. Now it was everywhere. The President of the United States knew. The press knew. The public knew. The question was no longer, did Patton do this? It was, what are you going to do about it? Eisenhower thought about Kasserine Pass, the American disaster in North Africa that had almost broken his army. He remembered the panic in the ranks, the lack of discipline, the way German panzers had rolled through American lines as if they were paper. Patton had helped fix that. He had brought fear with him as a tool. Fear of shame. Fear of his temper. Fear of being called a coward by a man who had chosen the profession of war with his eyes open. That fear had stiffened spines. Now another fear sat across from that one. The fear of what it meant if a famous general could assault defenseless men. And the army shrugged. Eisenhower knew Patton's voice so well he could hear it without picking up a phone. Ike, you need me. You know you do. I win battles. I make headlines that scare Hitler. You're going to throw that away because some weaklings couldn't handle a little shouting. He also knew what he would one day have to say to another kind of voice. A father, perhaps, whose son had been shaking on a cot when a general's hand came down. A mother who had listened to Drew Pearson and wanted to know why the man who did that still rode at the front of parades. Because he was useful, wasn't an answer Eisenhower wanted to give. He sat very still at his desk. Patton was not just a subordinate. He was a friend, a supporter, a man who had believed in Eisenhower before Eisenhower believed in himself. He had his own kind of twisted honor. But this was bigger than their friendship. If Eisenhower let this pass with only a private scolding and a forced apology, he would be writing a quiet rule into the heart of the army. The more medals you have, the less the rules apply to you. He chose. He would not court-martial Patton. A public trial would tear the Allied command apart, hand Hitler a propaganda gift, and drag the story out for months. But he would cut him where it hurt most. Not in the face, in the soul. Patton would lose his army. The 7th Army that had stormed across Sicily under his flag would be given to someone else. The next great operation, the invasion of mainland Europe that everyone knew was coming, though no one knew where or when, would not have George S. Patton at its head. He would be benched. He would still wear his stars. He would still attend briefings. He would still salute and be saluted. But when the moment came that he had dreamed of since boyhood, leading the main American blow in Europe, he would be watching it from the second row. For a man like Patton, that was a punishment worse than any court-martial. Eisenhower picked up his pen again. He began to write the orders that would quietly move the most aggressive general in the American army out of the center of the stage. He was not just disciplining a subordinate. He was betraying a friend to keep faith with something larger than friendship. In Sicily, a general's hand had cracked across a young man's face. Now, in North Africa, another general's signature would crack across the life of George S. Patton, and for both men, it would feel like the same thing. A blow they never saw coming, delivered by someone they thought was supposed to protect them. December 1943. Somewhere over the Atlantic, an airplane droned through the dark. Inside, Dwight D. Eisenhower sat strapped into his seat, a stack of papers in his lap, and a map spread across the small table in front of him. Outside that thin aluminum skin, an entire world war was waiting. He wasn't flying toward a battlefront this time. He was flying toward a decision. By now, the slapping incident in Sicily was more than a story. It was a scar. Washington knew. London knew. The press knew. Mothers in Nebraska knew. Every time Eisenhower walked into a briefing, he could feel the invisible question in the air. What are you going to do with Patton? He had already pulled the sharpest knife out of his hand. The Seventh Army in Sicily, the army Patton had driven across the island with ruthless speed, had been given to someone else. Patton, who believed he had been born to lead the main American thrust in Europe, found himself attending ceremonies, inspecting training grounds, and listening while other generals talked about plans that had once lived in his dreams. It felt like exile. He didn't show it in public. He still walked with the same swagger, still wore the same polished helmet and ivory-handled pistols. But behind the theatrics, something in him had gone tight and brittle. He had won battles, and the reward had been humiliation. Eisenhower knew exactly how he saw it. In Patton's mind, he had hit two cowards to keep an army from rotting. In return, his old friend had taken away the one thing that made his life make sense: command in combat. Now Eisenhower was about to do something that would feel, to George Patton, like a second betrayal. He was going to use him as a weapon without bullets. Spring 1944. Southern England looked like an armed camp wearing a farmer's coat. Hedges and stone walls hid tanks. Barns hid trucks. Roads were choked with American vehicles, British lorries, and soldiers from a dozen nations. Overhead, the sky hummed with transport planes and fighters. The Allies were building the greatest invasion force in history. Operation Overlord, the assault on Hitler's fortress Europe, was weeks away. Eisenhower had been given overall command. The eyes of Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin were all on him. If he failed, the war in Europe would drag on for years. If he succeeded, the end might be in sight. And in a quiet house in the English countryside, George S. Patton paced like a caged tiger. The official title sounded impressive: Commander of the U.S. Third Army. The reality, for now, was insulting. The Third Army didn't exist yet. On paper, it was a formation preparing for future operations. In practice, its commander's main job was something else entirely. Patton had been put in charge of a ghost, a fake army, complete with inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, fake radio traffic, and carefully staged leaks, was being built in southeast England, opposite the narrowest part of the English Channel. It had a name: the 1st U.S. Army Group. And to make that illusion perfect, it needed a face the Germans feared. They chose Patton. From coastlines and cliff tops, German reconnaissance aircraft snapped photographs of what looked like massive preparations for an invasion near Calais. Their spies reported seeing George Patton inspecting troops there. Their radio intercepts picked up traffic that suggested he was building a force aimed straight at the shortest crossing. Patton's very presence became part of a lie. The Wehrmacht believed that wherever Patton was, the main blow would fall. That belief was exactly what Eisenhower wanted. But for Patton, it felt like being turned into a cardboard cutout of himself. He drove along rows of inflatable tanks, their rubber skins gleaming faintly in the English drizzle. He watched soldiers practice climbing into plywood landing craft that would never leave the shore. At night, he stared at maps of France and saw his name not on any real arrow, but on a phantom. He said all the right things to the men around him. He talked about duty, about doing whatever the war required. He joked about fooling the bastards. But when the room was empty, the anger came. "I'm the best field commander they've got," he spat one evening, slamming his fist into the table hard enough to rattle coffee cups. "And they've got me babysitting balloons." The aides in the room kept their eyes on their papers. They were loyal to him. They also knew the one truth that none of them dared say out loud. He was here because he had slapped that boy. Because of a few seconds in a hospital tent months ago, the man who had always imagined leading the spearhead into Europe was now an actor in a deception play. Bait dangled in front of German binoculars. And the man who had decided that was Dwight Eisenhower. D-Day didn't begin for Patton. On June 6, 1944, as waves of American, British, and Canadian troops stormed the beaches of Normandy under machine gun fire and artillery, Patton was nowhere near them. He remained in England, his movements carefully controlled, his meetings carefully leaked. German intelligence reported, "Patton is still in the southeast. The invasion in Normandy must be a diversion." Patton watched the reports come in with a mixture of pride and fury. The pride came from knowing the deception was working. German divisions remained tied down at Pas de Calais, waiting for the real blow that would never come. The fury came from knowing he was not on those beaches, not in those landing craft, not on those cliffs. He stood in front of a map of Normandy, his jaw clenched, listening to a staff officer drone through casualty reports. He imagined himself there, shouting on the sand, pistol in hand, driving men off the beach with curses and promises. Instead, he was being used like an empty uniform on a scarecrow. For Patton, this was betrayal wrapped in necessity. For Eisenhower, it was the price of keeping a volatile weapon under control. But the war in France was about to change the equation again. By late July, the battlefield in Normandy had turned into a nightmare of hedgerows. Every field was a fortress. Every lane was a shooting gallery. German units, even when battered, fought like cornered animals. Allied progress was real, but painfully slow. Eisenhower needed a breakout. Operation Cobra, a massive American offensive aimed at smashing through German lines and opening the road into the French interior, was launched under General Omar Bradley. Bombers pulverized German positions. American forces punched through. Suddenly, the German front buckled. Now there was open country ahead. Roads, rivers, space. Space that cried out for someone who believed in speed, exploitation, relentless pursuit. Someone who would not stop at the first line on a map and say, "Good enough." Eisenhower looked around the table of his senior commanders. He saw steady men, solid men, careful men. He also saw, in the corner of his mind, a pair of ivory-handled pistols. It was time to do something that would sting his own pride and Patton's memory at the same time. It was time to trust him again. When Patton received the orders, he read them twice. The Third Army, his paper command, his ghost, was being activated for real. He would take it into combat in France. He would lead armored divisions in a sweeping advance once the breakout opened room to maneuver. He did not whoop. He did not punch the air. He sat quietly for a long moment, the paper in his hand. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he could hear the crack of his hand on that boy's cheek. He could also hear Eisenhower's voice, cold on the page, unworthy of an officer and a gentleman. Now those same hands and that same man were being handed a fresh army. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Gentlemen," he said to his staff, "they've turned us loose." From that point on, Third Army moved like it had been lit on fire. Across France, German soldiers learned to dread the name Patton, the way Allied soldiers dreaded the names of certain German units. His tanks rolled through villages, through fields, down narrow roads. He drove his officers, his men, his supply lines to the edge. He demanded speed. He demanded aggression. He demanded that his army behave the way he had always believed an army should, as a relentless, violent force that never left the enemy time to breathe. Villagers threw flowers. GIs painted Third Army on their vehicles with pride. Photographers loved him. Reporters followed him. The slapping scandal faded into the background noise of a Europe that was finally starting to see the Germans retreat for real. But for Eisenhower, the moral equation hadn't changed. He had not forgiven Patton. He had merely decided that winning the war required him. Every day that Patton pushed Third Army farther, Eisenhower lived with the contradiction. The man he had punished as a bully was now his most effective hammer. He watched the lines on the map move and knew that history would ask a brutal question. If Patton's tanks had not been there, how many more men would have died? And right behind it, if Patton had never been slapped down in Sicily, what might he have done later when no one dared say no to him? December 1944. The Ardennes forest lay under snow, quiet under a low gray sky. Then one night, the quiet ended. Hitler, desperate and delusional, launched a surprise offensive through the weakest part of the Allied line. German tanks and infantry smashed into thinly held American positions. Fog grounded Allied aircraft. Confusion reigned. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. In Paris, in Brussels, in every headquarters from Field Command to Supreme Allied HQ, maps changed overnight. A bulge appeared in the front line. Names like Bastogne, St. Vith, and Malmedy suddenly became the center of the war. Eisenhower called a meeting of senior commanders in a cold, echoing room in Verdun. They gathered around a large map laid out on a table. Cigarette smoke curled toward the ceiling. The atmosphere was tight, brittle, part anger, part disbelief, part fear. The Germans, once again, had punched a hole where everyone thought they couldn't. Around the table, Bradley, de Gaulle's representatives, British commanders, and Patton. He stood there in his polished helmet and boots, looking down at the same map they all saw, but seeing something else. The crisis was simple to describe and hard to solve. American units were surrounded, especially at Bastogne. The Germans were driving west. If the bulge widened, it could split the Allied front, delay victory, and cost tens of thousands of lives. Eisenhower walked around the table, jaw tight, pointing with his pipe. "We have to relieve Bastogne," he said. "The question is how fast." He turned to Patton. "How soon can you turn your army and attack north?" Ike asked. "I mean really attack, not send a token force." The room fell silent. Patton's Third Army was facing east. To pivot at 90 degrees in winter, on short notice, through bad roads, would be a logistical nightmare. Most commanders would have asked for a week, 10 days, maybe more. Patton didn't hesitate. 48 hours, he said. There was a beat of stunned silence. Bradley's eyebrows shot up. A British general snorted softly, assuming Patton was blustering. Eisenhower narrowed his eyes. "Be serious, George," he said. "I am serious," Patton replied. His voice was hard. "My staff has already prepared 3 contingency plans for a northward attack. I can have 2 divisions moving in 24 hours, more following in 48. He hadn't waited for the crisis to start planning. While others had been watching the bulge, he had already been imagining how to punch it in the nose. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. Eisenhower looked at him and saw all the contradictions in one man. The bully of the hospital tent, the genius of mobile warfare, the friend he had shamed, the weapon he had reluctantly chosen to use again. He also saw something else. Trust. Not trust in Patton's judgment about soldiers' souls. Not trust in his temper. But trust in his ability to do the one thing that now mattered most. Move faster than anyone else and hit harder than anyone else where it counted. "Very well," Eisenhower said quietly. "Do it." In that moment, in that icy room in Verdun, the betrayal turned inside out. The man Eisenhower had sidelined for hurting his own soldiers was now the man he was trusting to save thousands of them. Patton turned away from the table without another word. On the way out, one of his officers whispered, 48 hours, sir. Can we really?" "We'll do it in 36, Patton snapped. "Tell the quartermasters the war depends on them. Then tell them I said they're not allowed to fail." When Patton's tanks rolled to relieve Bastogne, breaking through German lines and opening a corridor to the surrounded town, men who had been holding out in frozen foxholes cheered at the sight of those white stars on olive drab. They didn't see the memory of a slap in a hospital tent. They saw rescue. After the war, the 2 men went very different ways. Eisenhower became the man who had to live with the decisions. He walked the beaches of Normandy when they were quiet and peaceful and heard the ghosts of D-Day. He visited the sites of concentration camps and understood in full what the war had really been about. He went home to America, wrote his memoirs, and eventually became President of the United States. Letters came to his desk in the White House from veterans, widows, orphans. Some thanked him for his leadership. Some asked why their husbands had never come home. He thought of Patton more often than he said, of the times he had defended him, of the time he had pulled him back, of the time he had turned him loose again, of Verdun, of Bastogne, of Sicily, of a hot tent and a shaking boy. He knew that history would always see them together, the calm, diplomatic supreme commander and the wild, volcanic field general. He also knew something history rarely bothers to say out loud. Leadership is not about loving your most talented people. Sometimes it's about leashing them. Patton, for his part, did not get the peaceful epilogue he might have imagined. After Germany's surrender, he was given command in Bavaria, a job that felt, to him, like an insult. He wanted to fight the Soviets. He wanted to keep riding forward. Instead, he was told to govern, to manage, to sit in meetings. He said things in public that made Washington cringe. He compared Nazis and communists in ways that sounded far too sympathetic to the former. He insulted allies. He spoke his mind when silence would have been wiser. Once again, he showed the part of himself that Eisenhower had always feared. In December 1945, George S. Patton was injured in a car accident in Germany. He died days later in a military hospital, paralyzed from the neck down. A man whose whole life had been motion now confined to a bed. Old soldiers never die, MacArthur said in a different speech. They just fade away. Patton did neither. He crashed out of history the way he had lived in it, violently, too soon, leaving unfinished arguments behind him. Years later, when historians dug through archives and letters, when psychiatrists gave a new name, PTSD, to what those boys in the Sicilian tents had gone through, the story of the slap came back with a different weight. What had looked, to some, like necessary cruelty began to look more like blindness. What had looked, to others, like unforgivable brutality had to be weighed against the lives Patton Speed had saved in France and the Ardennes. For Eisenhower, the calculus never became simple. He did not suddenly decide that Patton had been right all along. He did not excuse the slaps. He didn't rewrite the letter calling them unworthy. But he also did not pretend the war could have been won as quickly without the man he had punished. He had done something that the public almost never sees as heroic. He had stood between a talented monster and the men that monster commanded, not to destroy him, but to contain him, to redirect him, to use his fire without letting it burn down everything around it. The man in the field hospital tent had needed protection from his own general. Later, entire armies would need protection from the consequences of never letting that general off the leash again. That was the real human conflict at the heart of the Patton-Eisenhower story. Not just a slap in Sicily, not just a demotion, a deception command, or a triumphant return with Third Army. It was the moment one friend realized that the greatest betrayal he could commit was to pretend that talent excuses anything. Eisenhower betrayed Patton's self-image to keep faith with the men in the cots. Then he betrayed his own comfort to trust that same man when the world was on fire. Between those two acts of betrayal sits an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the leaders who save the most lives are not the ones with the loudest courage on the battlefield, but the ones who are willing to put a leash on it and live forever with the knowledge that no matter what they do, someone will call them a coward for it.